There we go. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. I'm very excited to welcome you to our first webinar that Dignii and Leda HR are offering. Kristen and I are thrilled to be able to have this conversation with you, because it's something that we feel is a really necessary conversation to have. So Kristen and I are going to introduce ourselves now. Kristen, do you want to take it away?
Sure. And Malika, I'll get you to just admit, there we go. To start, Liz and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are gathered here on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. That's largely comprised of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I am here in Maple Ridge, which is the land of the Capesea. And, Indigenous elders have traditionally been the custodians of this land, and we just wanted to express our gratitude. So Liz and I are going to share the duties here today. And Liz, do you want to explain or introduce yourself first?
Yeah, so I'm Elisabeth Cook. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Dignii Technologies. And what we do at Dignii is we do a lot of working consultation, but we have created the software to help companies to measure diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So we do that by providing confidential and anonymized surveys to the folks to actually understand who works in a workplace and who is missing in terms of looking, at benchmarking and reflecting the communities that we live and work in, and then we make recommendations around that. And we also have the pleasure of working with a lot of fabulous people, but the top of the pile at the moment is Leda HR, in being able to complement each other's services and work with clients together. So I'm very pleased to be able to be here. I have a background in law. And I teach employment law at UBC, so I'm looking forward to sharing some of those insights with you guys today, as well as just the elements around diversity and inclusion.
And I'm Kristen Bauer. I am one of the founding partners in Leda HR with my consulting partner and friend, Annika Lofstrand. We both have over 20 years of HR experience, with really spanning the full employee life cycle. So everything from hiring, attraction, recruitment, and selection to, unfortunately, occasionally termination. But the last 10 years, really, Annika and I have been focused on, even before we were calling this diversity, equity, and inclusion, we were really focused on what is belonging, what is inclusion. And that's been incredibly rewarding for us. So we've been consulting now together for 4 years. We do a lot of work in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy design, intercultural competency, unconscious bias training, mental health awareness and advocacy. And we do work supporting organizations to really create and foster psychologically safe and healthy workplaces, really in alignment with the national standard for psychological health and safety. I mostly have gone to the School of Hard Knocks, but I've also gone to BCIT to study HR, and I have an award of achievement in diversity and inclusion from UBC. And I will say that, Annika and I are very focused on working with women in particular. And so whenever we can support other women and to collaborate, we're looking for great, amazing, smart, like-minded people to do so. And that's why we love working with Elisabeth. So we're here today, and we have also a guest appearance by Jude. Interesting when we're talking about reproductive rights. Today, that we have a brand new little human that will be joining us.
He will. Hopefully he'll be silently joining us, but you never know.
That's all right. Listen, he can have his voice heard, right?
You may regret that. We'll see.
So let's talk a little bit about why. Why are we even here today? Why are we talking about something that we might think, what does this have to do with the workplace? And very likely you've heard this at some point in your career, likely early days in your career. There are some things you just don't talk about in the workplace. We don't talk about politics. We don't talk about religion. And oh my gosh, don't talk about your salary. We don't want other people to know what you're making. But really, since the overturning of Roe versus Wade, was that a month ago or so? I've had so many conversations with people, colleagues, friends, all. This is not just something that impacts women with air quotes, because Liz is going to talk a little bit about that language and terminology. But this is something that has really deeply touched so many people. And women who may not have shared their own abortion story a few years ago, they are now. I went for lunch with a colleague and a few weeks ago, and she just came right out with it. Like this is something that is at the surface for so many people. Another colleague of mine said that she was in a meeting recently, and the person in the meeting in the workplace just said, "I'm just really upset today because of this." Wow. And she shared her abortion story and the impact of Roe v. Wade. So, this is a moment in history that in many ways it's a tipping point that's very similar to what we saw with the Me Too movement and the Harvey Weinstein allegations, which of course we know now to be true. And absolutely, I believe this to be true. It's nobody's business what somebody chooses to do with their body. So, this is not a conversation necessarily about why somebody might seek an abortion and if that is morally wrong or right. That's not what this conversation is about. But we need to acknowledge that people are seeking them. And it's easy for us in Canada and I know we do this a lot, where we look to the South and say, well, we're better. Things are better in Canada. And, certainly things are better in terms of healthcare in general in Canada and women's reproductive rights. And abortions are available here widely. The reality is it's not always so easy to seek the reproductive healthcare that we need. And things like if you live rurally, if you experience language barriers, or cultural barriers, it can be really difficult to get the care that you need. And this has repercussions for women, for our communities, and yes, absolutely our workplaces. And really, when one group's rights begin to erode, other diversity groups take note. They're watching. They're listening. What might be next? The end of same-sex or intercultural marriage? It can be a really slippery slope, and it has implications for the workplace that we will explore a little bit later.
Thanks, Kristen. I just wanted to add, for me, this conversation is simultaneously really basic and really complex. It's basic because I believe, that we all have the right to make informed decisions about our bodies and have access to medical professionals to do that. But it's quite complex because of the politicization of the issue. And that's what we're seeing played out in the States. The States had the case Roe v. Wade, which found that there was a constitutional right to access abortion. And then there's been different limits and conversation around at what point you can do that, what has to happen for a woman to have access to that, to those services. And I'm using the term woman here just because that's what we used in the case law at the time, or to discuss how broad that term actually needs to be. But what we need to remember as well is that, in Canada, that is different. But the things that happen both in Canada and in the States, they do impact, how it is that we live and work. And when we talk about the rights that affect us, it impacts us in a lot of different ways. It impacts us personally and professionally, because it impacts all of the people within our community to varying different degrees. If this were just a conversation about abortion, we would talk about, this isn't about somebody that just gets pregnant by accident or chooses not to be pregnant. This is also about people that have medical complications and life complications and choose not to access those services. But that's not what this conversation is. This is really about the erosion of rights and what that means and the impact that can have in our workplace, because we can see it in a lot of different ways, right? We can see it in how we might lose talent, about how we, can have a decrease in diversity because these kind of laws can impact who can join the workforce in a reasonable way, who feels comfortable sharing things in a reasonable way. And that decreases the inclusion that we see in the workplace. And frankly, it also stifles a lot of creativity that we have. It can have a chilling effect on how we work and what we share and how we're doing that. So when we look at what it is that we're talking about, we're really talking about rights, and we're looking at what an erosion of rights looks like. This can be a really traumatizing conversation for people to have. You know, and I think we need to just be really mindful that it is a very challenging area for people to discuss, but we do need to take a step back and recognize that we're talking broadly about human rights and rights that are afforded to people to make decisions about what kind of medical services they can access. And that's just what it is. In Canada, much like Kristen just mentioned, we don't have a constitutionally entrenched right to access abortion. We have the right to access abortion under the Canadian Health Act. And broadly, we do have, you know, pretty lenient compared to other jurisdictions, access to abortion. The challenges that we have here are in terms of urban and regional areas and who can physically access some of those services. And that varies a lot by province and territory, which is an issue that, you know, merits discussion in and of itself. And when we really think about what it is that we're talking about, we're not talking about, you know, that idea of women's rights and people for pregnancy. You flick to the next slide, please, because there's been some issue around the language that we use, and I've heard this actually in a couple of different places. We saw it on Dr. Kiara Bridges was testifying in the States, and a senator who doesn't merit name recognition really challenged how she was describing people with the capacity for pregnancy rather than just using the term women. And it's a really interesting piece. That particular person was doing it just to get a lot of views on Twitter and to cause a little bit of drama for his own political gain, which is a fabulous example of the over politicization of something as simple as in using inclusive language. But it does raise an interesting issue that we need to be aware of. We're in the process of in the broader society of recognizing various gender identities and how people choose to identify themselves, both in their names, in their pronouns, and in their presentation. And we need to be mindful that we want to be inclusive, but being inclusive doesn't mean we have to have sterilized language or quarantine certain words. We don't want to lose, you know, some of the historical impact that has carried us through, right? We saw this with Stonewall, you know, in the States, and getting a lot of, you know, rights for the LGBTQ community. That was the majority of those folks were trans folks and Black trans folks that fought for that and got rights for everybody else. And we don't want to lose, you know, the origin of this. So when we talk about having, you know, the women's movement and women's rights, there's some historical references there that we want to make sure that we retain in the language that we use. So we need to recognize that the history of women and of pregnant women, it is a significant thing. Women have historically been the victim of gender-based discrimination, and our identities are really often shaped by those experiences, and we don't want to lose that. And a lot of folks that I've spoken to recently have been really concerned about, you know, if we are talking about abortion and we take the word women out of that, like, we're losing a lot. We're losing something as individuals and as a collective of having a voice be heard. But the challenge that we're faced with now in determining the language that we use is that we're talking about a body that has been both celebrated and punished in a variety of different ways, right? Living in a body that a government and judicial systems feel that they have the right to control is something that's very challenging for the majority of people that identify as women, and for a smaller minority of people who, you know, may have been born with a uterus that identify in a different manner, right? What we should be talking about is the care and dignity that we afford to people, because that's what we're losing. And the reality is that, you know, the law in the US, it's affecting anybody that has a uterus. Nobody is checking your pronouns, your uterus, and what you're doing with it. That's what those laws, you know, are changing. There's a feminist, a moral feminist moral philosopher by the name of Kate Mann, that she wrote that abortion bans are misogynistic because they target and primarily victimize women who are seen as no longer fulfilling their rightful reproductive and social roles as mothers, and in particular as caregivers in general. This is beyond ironic that I'm juggling a little person while we're doing this. But what she ended up saying, you know, at the end of a piece on this, is that what she's talking about is who's potentially affected by abortion bans. So we're talking about people who can get pregnant. So I think the two important things to remember when we're looking at the language here is that context is really important, and knowing your audience is really important, because that can really affect how it is that we're describing things, right? Like there was an article in the Washington Post recently that said, you know, the language that we use should be a language of addition, not a language of subtraction. So we need to think about that when we think about how we want to phrase things. You know, if it's in a work context, if you're looking at how you describe people, or if we're having this particular conversation. And it really should be adding people to the universal experience of pregnancy that really does transcend beyond generations, and does include pregnant women and other pregnant people. So we can say pregnant women and other pregnant people in how it is that we address things. But I think remembering the context that you're discussing these issues with, and looking at who your audience is, and then, you know, making sure that we're not sterilizing our language, we're adding people. It's a language of addition, not a language of subtraction.
I love that. A language of addition, not subtraction. I think that's going to be my takeaway here today. Thanks, Liz. Yeah, it's you know, when we first started talking about this, Elisabeth and I, you know, I certainly was greatly impacted by the Roe v. Wade situation, and I felt actually a real primal physical reaction to it. It was incredibly upsetting to me, and I realized that you know, there's so much that I don't know about this issue. I mean, I feel strongly about it, but I also think it's really important to be curious and to learn what you can. And I remembered that I had purchased this book, the Turnaway Study, a couple of years ago, and it's fascinating. So I grabbed it off of my bookshelf. And you know, it's a good book because I've got a whole bunch of little markers in here and tons of stuff highlighted. And so we wanted to share a little bit about this study because it is significant. It's really the only one of its kind. It is based in the US, but of course we know that there are you know, comparisons to Canada. And so we wanted to share a little bit of information from the study. So this was conducted at the University of California in San Francisco. It was a 10-year study. It included 1,000 women from clinics in 21 of states in the US. And, you know, on a note of how well the study was crafted, you know, it has produced 50 peer-reviewed papers in top medical and social science journals. So it is really a well-respected study. Women who received abortions and women who were denied abortions were similar at the time they sought abortions. So that was a bit of the starting point. Their lives diverged after in ways that were directly attributed to whether they received an abortion or not. So what they found through this study, and there's a lot, you can actually, Malika's put a link in the chat. There's a lot of information about this particular study on the internet you can find. But I'm just going to really highlight the economic hardship piece, because this absolutely has a huge impact on our communities, our society, and our workplaces as well. So denying a woman an abortion creates economic hardship and insecurity that lasts for years. Some examples of this are women who were turned away and went on to give birth experienced an increase in household poverty lasting 4 years relative to those who received an abortion. Years after an abortion denial, women were more likely to not have enough money to cover basic living expenses like food, housing, and transportation. Being denied an abortion lowered a woman's credit score, increased a woman's amount of debt, and increased the number of their negative financial records, such as bankruptcies and evictions. And by 5 years, women denied abortions were more likely to be raising children alone, so without family members or male partners. On the flip side, the study found that women who received a wanted abortion are more financially stable, set more ambitious goals, raise children under more stable conditions, and are more likely to have wanted children later. So obviously, this is all a lot of stuff for women to deal with. And as through the pandemic, the line between personal life and work life has really been forever blurred. We can't separate the two any longer. So let's talk a little bit now about mental health. A lot of times, it's a very common belief. A lot of times people think if you are experiencing depression or anxiety, that something must have happened. There was one trigger. And the reality is that it's actually a much more complex thing. So, these are some of the things that impact and determine if we're mentally healthy or mentally unwell. So 15% is biology, so genetics. You could have a predisposition to something, just like some people have a predisposition to cancer. Healthcare, so things like your access to healthcare, the healthcare system, wait times. A lot of this stuff, obviously, we're thinking a lot about right now because it's all in the news about, the pandemic and the ripple effect that's having on society and our healthcare. But again, it goes back to what Liz and I were saying about abortion and reproductive healthcare availability in Canada. Depending on where you live, you may not have easy access to the services that you need. Things like environment. So, literally our physical environment, do we have access to green spaces? And the big one here is your life. So 50% is your life. And things like your income, your socioeconomic status, your gender, employment and working conditions. Can you work for example, if you can't access childcare and you're the single mother, it's more likely that you're going to be the one who is paying the price for that. So there's a lot of things that go into how we determine our mental health. And let's talk a little bit about how this directly, what did the study find? How does this directly impact our mental health? So we'll go to the next slide, please, Malika. So this is what the study found. In the short run, women denied abortions have worse mental health, higher anxiety, and lower self-esteem than women who receive an abortion. There are no long-term differences between women who receive and women who are denied an abortion in depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, self-esteem, life satisfaction, drug abuse, or alcohol use. And when we consider those things that I mentioned earlier about the impact on women who were denied an abortion, we can see how these things of mental illness, income, socioeconomic status, belonging, and access to healthcare. So how does this all connect to the workplace? I think it's obvious. We can see some of these connections already. But this is something that I like to say a lot when I'm working with my clients, in particular HR and people managers, is that guess what? You don't have to have all the answers. I remember when I first started in HR, I thought, oh my gosh, I have to have all the answers for my clients. And I pretty quickly realized that, first of all, when we're dealing with people, nothing is ever simple. It's not black or white. It's often shades of gray. And so actually what can be really valuable, much more valuable than having all the answers, is to have the ability to ask good questions and really listen to the answers, listen to what that other person is telling you. So, for example, when putting together or reviewing an existing benefits offering or putting together some programs for employees, you need to go straight to the expert. Go to your employees. So let's talk a little bit now. We'll go to the next slide about how you can learn and gather important insights from your employees.
Yeah, thanks. This is a big piece of what we do at Dignii is looking at who your employees are, so surveying them. So you know, there's a lot that we can gather just in working with people, but a lot of the information about, you know, where somebody is in their life and where they fit in terms of their diversity, because you know, no two people are exactly the same, is a really important thing to understand. It's very important to find out who your employees are and who works for you. It's equally as important to find out who's not working for you and what the reasons for them not being there are. You know, we're in a moment now that, you know, we see so many clients wanting to hire more in certain equity groups, but not being able to fulfill, you know, those numbers, or they hire people, but then they leave and they see a higher level of staff turnover. So understanding, you know, not just who's in your workplace, but who's not in your workplace, as well as, you know, understanding what their experience is really important, because it's one thing to try and get, you know, all of your numbers to identify, you know, that you're reflecting the community or that you're meeting workforce availability numbers. It's another to have an inclusive workplace where everybody feels like they do have that sense of belonging and can work really well together, so that you can capitalize on the business case for DEI in terms of, you know, looking at that return on your investment of having an inclusive workplace. So you need to do that. So that really is looking, you know, at collecting some demographic data, and then and also one of the things that we do a lot of Dignii is looking at the intersectional data points. And sometimes, you know, when we've already alluded to a few different groups that might identify, you know, as people that are pregnant, but it might not just be women. You might be talking about trans folks. You might be talking about, you know, people that are experiencing a mental illness or a disability at the same time as well. We have to be careful not to silo people into only being able to sort of tick one box as a diversity metric. We need to be more broad than that. And doing that with a third-party provider can be really helpful, because it's quite arduous to have to actually collect all of that data and keep it secure. It's another kettle of fish to make sure that everybody actually responds to the surveys. Often, for reasons that you may already guess, people don't want to tell their employers some of that private information that they have, but they want their employers to know that private information so that they can get the support that they need in the workplace. And, you know, a third-party provider, you know, can provide that bridge to help you to create the recommendations that you need, and then being able to, you know, like Kristen had just said, you know, being able to actually have a good sense of, you know, what do your employees need and what do they want. Being able to, you know, offer some surveying and pieces around that can be a really helpful piece as well. Thanks.
Great. And then the next one is arguably, I would say, the scary one. A lot of employers don't necessarily want to do this. Like, what a wild idea to actually talk to your employees. And there's reasons why, you know, will you open up a whole can of worms? Will there be all of these things that come out of the woodwork that, you know, how do you deal with? Is there legal liability? What do you do? But really, you know, creating an environment where people can talk about what is going on in the world or impacting them personally is often what a person needs to feel a sense of inclusion and belonging in the workplace. And sometimes when we share and when we say, you know, I'm feeling this, somebody else will say, yeah, you know what, me too. You know, I'm feeling the same way. And so that's an important step into creating a sense of belonging and inclusion in the workplace. I recently read this, and I am going to paraphrase it, but somewhere on social media, a Black woman said this, and I found it to be really, really powerful and a bit of an aha moment for me as a white woman. And she said this: when racism and social injustice happens in the world, I can't leave that outside of work. To work, I am still a Black woman. And I thought, yeah, of course, like, we can't, whatever your skin is, you know, whether it's your skin color, your sexuality, your gender, disability, whatever that is, we can't just take that off like a jacket and hang it up and then go about our work. Those days of just keep your personal life at home, don't bring it to the workplace, those are long, long gone. And here's the thing, you know, our clients, our customers, our external stakeholders, they're also experiencing the world. So this is stuff that we can't just leave. So you can provide opportunities for your employees to speak, you know, to share their opinion and their thoughts, their beliefs, their experiences. You can do this in town halls, one-to-one meetings if you're a people leader, team meetings, or facilitated focus groups and dialogue sessions. You know, after the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, I should say, you know, Annika, my consulting partner, and I started to get you know, requests from clients to say, can you just come facilitate a dialogue session? We don't need you to be a subject matter expert. And by the way, of course, we're not. As two white women, we would certainly never speak on behalf of anyone of color. But to be able to hold that space for people to have a conversation and just to share how they're feeling can be a really powerful thing. And if you really want to understand your employees, who they are, and what they need, what they want to see in the workplace, a focus group with an external third party can be a really, well, I would say a somewhat safe environment. I can't determine if it's safe for somebody else, but it does provide a neutral environment for people to speak about issues that are impacting them in the world, but also within the workplace. And the other thing that I would put a plug in for, you know, because this is, I know, is a big thing for both Annika and I at Leda HR, but also with Dignii and Liz is, you know, you can do this also very confidentially as part of pulse surveys and use those things to assess your needs and initiatives as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I think to remember when you're engaging employees like this is, you know, you kind of always want to have in your background, in the background, how are you going to be accountable and how are you going to be transparent? Because if you open the door to employees to disclose information to you and to share their experiences and their feelings and talk about their needs, you need to be able to be frank about what you're going to do with that at the end. Because one of the most deflating things that I see employers do is get employees excited about sharing information and that sense of hope and want to see things change or shift in a certain direction, and then seeing it fall flat. That's a very difficult thing to come back from. So, you know, being able to be really clear, like you're talking to your employees, this is, you know, the conversation that we want to have. And, you know, this is what we think the next step will be, or this is what we're going to do with that information. And this is what you can anticipate as an outcome, and being really transparent about that process. Because sometimes it's really hard. You might get a lot of information from employees and it might be like, well, this is something that actually has, you know, it's going to require a cultural shift. Like we're talking about a lot of changes that need to take place. That's going to take us a long time to do. So we need to be honest about that, that there's, you know, it's not something that we can turn around in a quarter. This is something that we're going to have to work on, you know, for a long period of time, or this is something that needs a bigger budget. So we're going to have to, you know, shift things around in a certain way. But those are things that you want to be considering is how you're going to be accountable and transparent to your employees when they share that information with you.
Boy, I echo that. You know, we hear this a lot from, you know, long tenured employees in organizations that say, you know what, I have seen this, this organization's called it a million different things over the years. They ask for our feedback and then they don't do anything with it. So you can really disengage and turn people off. And then the other thing to be really aware of too is that particularly if a major incident has happened. So let's say, for example, again, the murder of George Floyd, employees and people of color were feeling very raw. And we're feeling exhausted because, you know, their white friends or their white colleagues kept going to them and saying, are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? Hey, can you now educate me on what it means to be a Black person? You know, that is all very exhausting for people too. So there's a lot to be aware of, certainly, in setting the tone and creating an environment where it is actually safe. Psychologically safe and healthy for people to have these conversations, pardon me. So, you know, we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk just a little bit about some elements to foster a culture of inclusion, because honestly, you can't, to Elizabeth's point, you can't go from 0 to 60. You can't just say, okay, it's a safe environment now, talk. Yeah, it does take a little bit of intentionality. One of the things that I get asked frequently by people, in particular, around having a conversation about mental health, if they think an employee is struggling, they will say to me, "How do I talk to them?" I say, "Well, don't wait until you think they're struggling. You have to normalize the conversation around mental health. You also have to normalize the conversation, equity, inclusion, belonging. You have to talk about this all the time, not just when something really horrible happens in the world. Because what you do is you set the tone of, yeah, this is our environment. It's okay to talk about this stuff here. We welcome it. So, one of the things in particular, if you're a leader, is you need to model the behaviors that you're encouraging. And so some of these behaviors, whether you're a leader or not, I think are really important because we all have skin in the game. We are all accountable for creating workplace cultures that are inclusive and that really, really foster a sense of belonging and absolutely prioritize equity. So be authentic and vulnerable. Now, the V word here, vulnerable, sends shivers through many people. I know Anik and I have had lots of conversations, particularly with leaders, about this topic, where they struggle with, oh my gosh, how vulnerable should I be? How authentic should I be? And so certainly that's something that we all need to figure out for ourselves, what our comfort level is. But I do know that when we are authentic and vulnerable, we are better able to connect with other people, and other people are better able to connect with us. Lean into those hard conversations. We don't like hard conversations because guess what? They're hard. They're uncomfortable. But, I would argue that when we're a little uncomfortable, that's when we grow. So, don't avoid those hard conversations. You may also just be extending a lifeline to somebody that needs it when you don't even realize it. Share different perspectives. This is what diversity is. If we actually create environments that are inclusive and safe for interpersonal risk taking, we create an environment where it's okay. It's actually celebrated to share different perspectives. And it's okay to say, you know what, like this big thing's happening in the world right now. Can we talk about it? Let's have a dialogue. It's not a debate. We're going to have a dialogue, which means that Elisabeth, your opinion is valid, your experience is valid, so is mine. I'm a different person. Maybe I have a different perspective. And then the fourth one really is pretty specific to workplaces. This is something that we hear a lot in our consulting work is, how do I get people to actually get on board with this idea? Well, you have to really consider if you're inviting people into the conversation. So if you're creating an environment where people actually feel safe to be curious or to share a different perspective, or are you creating an environment where you're just going to call people out and make them feel bad and shameful and guilty? Because one approach is actually going to create conversation and help people to better understand each other. The other approach, deepen your divide. So certainly there is a time and place for calling people out. Sometimes that needs to happen. But when you are really trying to create opportunities for discussion about really hard things, there's really no place for shame or guilt.
I think those are all really great points, and I think what they speak to me a lot is a culture of inclusion is not always something that happens organically. For a variety of different reasons. It's something that we need to skillfully foster in the workplace. Because there's a few other things that happen in the workplace, right? We have legislation around bullying and harassment and discrimination in the workplace that we need to be mindful of. Very aware of creating psychologically safe workplaces. And those are really difficult things sometimes to execute. They can be, everything's really easy until all of a sudden it's not. And that's a time where, pulling in some expertise to help you to manage those things can be a really helpful thing. Like leading into hard conversations is something that you want to be sure that you're equipped to do. And there's a lot of different resources that are available to help that to take place in the workplace so that it's constructive. We're not just opening up a huge conversation in talking about, abortion at work, or about particular challenges or world events, without understanding the boundaries and the manner in which you're best served to facilitate that conversation in the workplace. Because we're trying to make sure that every individual, and as an employer, making sure that every individual has a psychologically safe workplace, free from bullying and harassment and discrimination. And doing that, you need to consider everybody's experience. So there is some forethought and some strategy, frankly, that should go into looking at creating that culture of inclusion. Mostly so that you know where some of your gaps are. If you know that a particular topic is really difficult, then you might address it in a different way, than you would something that, individuals in their own workplace have. And then having boundaries and knowing, like, when a conversation is going down a road that's unproductive, everybody understands what the ground rules are for ending that conversation and coming back to that when you're more equipped to have it. Just some other things to consider in that element.
Yeah, and I think what I would add to that too is you're reminding me of a conversation that that we had with a colleague recently about women in general in the workplace when it comes to things like, well, let's just talk about pregnancy for a minute, without getting into a big thing here, but some people can't get pregnant. Some people have lost pregnancies through miscarriage or abortion. And things that can happen in the workplace can be triggering, like that baby shower that's happening in the lunchroom. For those who maybe have lost a child or have experienced trauma, these things that don't always seem obvious to us can have an impact psychologically on our colleagues. And so it's I think just being aware that everybody is going through different things that we may not be aware of. We're likely not aware of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go to the next slide, please, Malika. So I think we just wanted to raise some areas where you could really, apply an inclusion lens in the workplace. Do you have policies for maternity, paternity, parental leaves? Are they inclusive of all genders? It's one of the things that Annick and I do a lot of is reviewing policies and procedures. And there's always opportunity to update language, in particular around gender, for sure. How supportive or not are you for those who are going on a leave, while they're on a leave, and while they're returning from a leave? Do you provide a benefits flex spending account that actually takes into account, all genders and all needs? Do you provide flexible work? And I think a big one here is, certainly when we talk about the economic impact on women, whether they've accessed an abortion or not. And the reality is that women are still underpaid in Canada. And so until that we have something such as gender equity in compensation, we don't have equality. So, really reviewing your compensation and your benefits offerings by gender and intersectionality for equity is important. And I will mention also too that for men who take a paternity leave, that is often still, even though it's available, it is often still looked down upon. And I remember a director a few years ago who took a year off for paternity leave, and he said it impacted his career, and he ended up leaving that organization as a result. So when we consider something like the Great Resignation, which, by the way, are we all tired of hearing about yet? How we support our employees through significant life events is crucial. Absolutely. If somebody doesn't feel supported, they will leave. They have options.
I think something that I would like to add to this is that I've often, in working with some large companies over the years, depending on who you ask, some people in an organization know about these things and others don't. So making sure that everybody is aware. I've worked with organizations that, we're actually not doing really well for maternity benefits, like our environment, the way that we, provide, salary increases and compensation package increases depends on, like amount of service. And when women leave for a maternity leave, they miss that gap. But then I speak to the person in HR and the person in finance, and they figured out their own little workaround for it. So that when somebody takes a mat leave, they figure out a way to make sure that that person, still has service, so that they don't miss those pay increases in their career because they've had to take time out. So sometimes we have workarounds internally because we have allies and advocates internally that have found ways to do their jobs differently and in a way that's more inclusive for everyone. But it hasn't been communicated equally to everybody, and everybody doesn't actually know that that's happening. So they think that there's problems when in fact there's just some unofficial solutions that are already in place. So if you look at this list and you're like, oh, well, we tick all of those boxes, my challenge would be like, does everybody know that you do that? Not only are there areas that you can improve, but is everybody aware of that, of what they actually have access to? Other partners that either identify as fathers, or as non-binary folks that identify as other new parents that are like a non-birthing or essentially a non-birthing parent. Do they know what they have access to, and is that something that's that is supported broadly rather than just from one individual that actually grants you that access? I think that can often be something to look at as well.
Right. So this is your inclusion superpower. Annika and I say this all the time, all the time. Choosing curiosity over judgment is a game changer. Absolutely. When we are curious, when we set aside our judgment and our pre-existing beliefs to really listen, like absolutely truly listen, we can better understand each other. And this is absolutely vital to creating cultures and communities of belonging. This is how we build bridges. This is how we lessen the divide, in particular in a time and place in history where it feels like that divide is huge.
Yeah, I echo that. I think curiosity is one of the most important skills that we can develop. And I think with that, we don't have to be curious, without boundaries. We can have boundaries for that, and looking at how we're curious personally and professionally, and especially around like how we have challenging conversations, looking at that. So, allow yourself to be curious and allow yourself to be strategic in that approach, because it can be really overwhelming, if you try to fix everything all at once. That you want to be mindful of how you go about doing that and how you communicate all of, certainly how you continue to meet all of your obligations as an employer as well, so that you're not exposing yourself to any kind of liability. And I think this is a really good point. I think we have a resource slide that we're going to share, but before I open it up to questions and comments, I just want to say a little official ending of the webinar, because we're not going to record the questions and comments piece, which is not my practice to do that. So I wanted to thank everyone for taking part in the webinar. And if you're interested in the slides or furthering the conversation, please just pop your email in the chat. There's also a link that will be shared in the chat to book an appointment to have a further conversation. I think I've allocated some calendar time in there as well.